This is how gear changed the game. A curious exploration of the evolution of sports and the role the tools used to play the sports had in that evolution. Coaches changed the game, players changed the game, rules changed the game, but gear has just as big of a factor in changing the game. Since the dawn of time, mankind's ability to adapt, evolve, and grow has rested on our ability to invent new tools and put them to good use. But invention comes out of necessity, and inventions are useless unless someone knows how to put them to good use. So we're going to look at what it is about the game that caused the necessity for invention, the innovations created as a result, and the legendary players and coaches who put those innovations to good use. We'll also look at the stats affected by these changes and the ripple effects that can still be seen in the game to this day, citing books, articles, and stat sheets, talking with ex-coaches, ex-players, experts who really know the game. Now, I released a primer episode that really speaks to the core of what this series is all about. It's only a few minutes long. If you haven't heard it, I recommend you check it out. It just talks a little bit about the chaos theory, how sports in themselves, each sport is its own ecosystem, a closed-off environment with multiple factors all trying to gain an advantage among chaos. And that's really what spurs evolution. Everyone trying to gain an advantage among the chaos, and once something gains an advantage, everything else either has to catch up and adapt or die off. And that happens in sports. Sports evolve. Every few years, the game looks a little bit different than it did a few years before that. You go back a few years before that, and the game looks even more different. It's what I love about sports the most. There's chaos, so there's always an element of unpredictability. Anything could happen. And also, the game changes throughout the years. The game is always evolving. And whenever you're watching greatness, you're watching something new in the game, you may be looking at the future because everything else within the game may have to adapt to that. Isn't that exciting? I love this stuff. I'm your host, Alex Kindig Sherman, about to guide you through the evolution of the game of football and how the helmet had a significant role in the changes throughout the game, throughout the years. Almost 2 centuries now. Jeez, time flies, huh? The helmet is so influential in the game of football that an image of a helmet has become synonymous with the game itself, an icon of the sport. And one fact about sports is you don't reach the level of celebrity the football helmet is at without achieving greatness consistently. And the football helmet has helped a lot of coaches and players achieve that level of greatness. We're about to find out how gear changed the game. The sounds of the first day of training camp. It's a sign that fall is near and football is about to be in full swing. And on that first day of training camp, whether you're pro, college, high school, down to Pop Warner, there's been a drill around for decades that has been a common part of the first day of training camp. Sometimes the first drill that you run at all, as the coach comes out and says it's time to separate the men from the boys. It's a one-on-one drill called the Oklahoma drill. Now, for the uninitiated, the Oklahoma drill, it's this one-on-one drill that simulates being on the line of scrimmage. It simulates the power you need for blocking. You get down in a 3-point stance, facing one another, the whistle sounds. You explode into one another. You hear the clacking of the helmet, the clattering of the shoulder pads. And just like that, we're into another football season. But the Oklahoma drill wasn't always a common part of training camp. In fact, the Oklahoma drill is a sum of a lot of different changes that affected the game, from rule changes to strategy changes to the invention of new types of equipment. And without all of those things happening, that Oklahoma drill wouldn't exist. And one of the things we're going to find out over the next 3 episodes is the origin of the Oklahoma drill. It's quite an interesting story. But first, we got to go back not just to the first day of training camp, but back to the origins of the game itself, right around the Civil War. And the Civil War is actually a perfect example of how the tools we use for the battlefield can change everything. Before the Civil War, it was older school battle tactics. You had entire armies that would line up in a field, and they had their muskets shooting musket ball volleys back and forth. And those old musket rifles, really to be accurate, you needed to have your target be about 30 yards away. That's really close. That's a lob wedge, buddy. And even then, those musket balls are about as accurate as your chip shot. Not great. But the ability of those weapons was what set the tone for the tactics within battle. Generals would strategize around the ability of not only their soldiers, but the tools of war that they were using, which was muskets and musket balls. But a new invention called the mini-ball would change all of that, though not right away. The mini-ball wasn't actually a ball. It was the shape of a bullet, what we now know as a bullet. And the rifle it was being shot out of had a spiral groove cut into the barrel, so it spun the mini-ball as it exited the rifle. This gave the mini-ball greater distance, greater accuracy, and higher velocity. Those musket balls that were accurate from 30 yards away but could maybe hit a target from 100 yards away, well now, with the mini-ball, you could accurately hit a target a quarter mile away. And because of the inventiveness of the mini-ball and the shape of it, it made reloading faster. Reloading a musket takes a long time, but with the mini-ball, being able to reload faster and paving the way for repeater rifles, revolvers, and breech-loading rifles, suddenly you're able to hit targets further away with more accuracy, more destruction, and more often. It makes your troops more effective and more lethal than ever before. So when this new weapon is introduced into battle, it's meeting old school tactics that are meant to fight against weapons that are now out of date. The result is a slaughter. Now imagine being a general on the side that has this new innovation. You don't have to worry about your soldiers getting hit with volleys from muskets at all because you can be out of range and still hit your target. That's quite an advantage. You can fire more often. That's an advantage. Your troops that are now 4 times more efficient with this new weapon are now 4 times as powerful. Now imagine being on the receiving end of that. You're trying to return fire against an enemy that is out of range and they're still hitting you. And you don't know what this weapon is, but it's being fired at you more often and it is causing more gruesome injuries than you've ever seen before. And they're killing the soldiers around you at such a rate that when you're told to retreat, you can't even turn and run because the grass below you is so slick with blood. And if you were one of the lucky few soldiers who survived that retreat, you're thinking, we better change. We better adapt. We better catch up to whatever they have, because if we don't, we're going to be destroyed. That's how much a difference new innovations, new tools introduced to the battlefield can make. To this day, the Civil War is America's deadliest war. 600,000 people died in battle. Historians point to 3 major factors that caused such a high number. Both sides were Americans, disease and wound infections were prevalent, and because industrial-era tools of war outmatched Victorian-era tactics for war. The tactics would adapt throughout the war, and by the time the treaty was signed in Appomattox, warfare had evolved to something different than it was 4 years prior. Now you might be thinking, God, that's a gruesome way to start out a sports podcast. Yeah, life is chaos and humans are animals, so act accordingly. It articulates the point. Generals get statues, soldiers get the glory, but the tools help you gain the victory. And the Civil War is one of the many examples of how invention becomes the catalyst for evolution and change. The war ended and the Industrial Revolution hit full stride. And with it, that meant young men were leaving their rural farms, they were leaving the frontier, and finding their way to the city where the jobs were. They could go work in a factory, or they could go to a university. And on the campus of these universities, a new game was emerging. It was kind of a hazing ritual, but kind of a sport itself, a mix between rugby and soccer, and that game would eventually become football. But it looked a lot different than it does today.
Really early on, it didn't look like football at all. So you had some colleges who were playing mainly soccer, others were playing rugby. So then what happened is they started getting together and started forming some rules to kind of change the game into what we know now. So instead of playing the soccer and the rugby, they started playing what we now know as American football.
Now you're probably wondering who that is.
My name is Ken Crippen. I'm the founder and lead instructor at the Football Learning Academy. It's an online school that teaches pro football history. And so we like to cover all aspects of pro football history from the very beginning up till current day.
And Ken really knows his stuff. He's even been involved with the Pro Football Researchers Association. We're going to hear from him in a little bit when we talk about the beginning of what would become the NFL. So as Ken alluded to, the different campuses had their different version of the game, but there were a lot of similarities. So let me just kind of broadly explain how the game looked at all these places at the time. It wasn't 11 versus 11. It was 25 versus 25, or sometimes numbers bigger than that. It was a game of kicking things through uprights. It was a game of getting the ball down the field, but you could kick it, you could grab it, you could run with it, and everybody would just pile up on one another. They'd try and kick the ball loose, punch the ball loose, and as you can imagine, when you have 50 people in a dog pile punching and kicking, lots of injuries start to occur. And so the opposition of football starts to develop, including from university presidents who didn't like the fact that their own students on their own campus were getting the crap kicked out of them. And so that's when the teams of these schools said, you know what, our president's right. We can't be beating the crap out of each other on this campus. Let's go to another school's campus and beat the crap out of them. Great idea. But when they did that, they realized, hey, you're actually kind of playing a little bit of a different rule than me, and our rules say this, but you're trying to do this, and you can't do that. So there was the need for a standard of the game. There was a need for a rule book. And that's where the father of football, Walter Camp, comes into play. He was a player at Yale, an athlete at Yale, ends up being the coach and a referee at Yale, and he is one of the developers of the rule book during the first few decades of football. So once a standard is set, everybody's playing the same game under the same rules, well, the game starts to take off. Spectators start to show up. Schools are playing one another. It becomes an event. But there's another reason why the popularity of football starts to take off. Here's author Matthew Cheney.
We came out of the Civil War, and exactly, we're into industrialism, urbanization is blowing up. There's more mobility. The railroads are really advancing after the Civil War. So you get this great surge of team sports. Team sports begin. That's what I think is the key. Team sports. After the Civil War, immediately baseball is on fire. That's the first popular game. The emerging factor, obviously, industrialism, transportation. Transportation and communication always dictates sport popularity. It dictates the spectacles that we have, various sports spectacles. It's transportation and or communication. We get the Sunday paper. By the way, the Sunday paper was created by football. Football spawned the Sunday paper for Joseph Pulitzer in the New York World. He answered the call for Sunday scores and results that everyone else hedged on for about 10 years. And I think it was 1879 or 80. He said, boom, here's the Sunday paper. New York World starts popping 2 million subscribers.
Again, that's Matthew Cheney. He's an author, former college football player. He's done a lot of great research. Check out his website, fourwallspublishing.com. He's got a lot of articles in there based on the research he's done, going back through all kinds of old newspaper articles. And he's done some interesting work on the history of the game when it comes to health issues, equipment use, and things of that nature. He also has written multiple books, one of those being Spiral of Denial, History of Muscle Doping in Football. Oh, and there's something else he specializes in.
I always counteract football BS. And, I'm real good at that because I coached and I played.
Yeah, that was it. And the guy's done his homework as well. And he's right about that. If it weren't for the explosion, this new advanced way of traveling, where would any sport be? If we weren't able to travel efficiently, how would baseball be able to pull off a 150-game season? How would schools quickly travel from one to another? Communication's the same way. Where would communication be without sports, and where would sports be without communication? Football is the biggest cash cow in television. Think about you yourself. Would you still be a cable subscriber if you didn't want to watch sports? Of course not. Now, the first actual football game is credited as being Princeton versus Rutgers in 1869. And the popularity really starts to grow from there because, again, communication is better, so it's more accessible to fans. Even if you can't go to the game, you can still find out what happened. You can find out what the score is. Transportation's better, so schools that were a little bit more remote can develop their own teams and develop their own fans and start to play more games. There were also people who grew critical of the game the more they found out about it. A lot of people got hurt playing football. Some people got killed playing football, and that didn't rest well with a lot of people. There were still university presidents that did not want their schools playing this game. So in that way, the game was in danger as critics wanted to abolish the game completely, and some comparing it to awful things like bear baiting and dog fighting. And then within the game, you had teams that were finding loopholes and little tricks within the game that, was making the game more violent, more dangerous, all for the sake of just winning a game, winning a little bit of pride. So the rules needed to adapt to these conditions that were going on, and some changes need to be made that could make the game a little bit safer and a little bit more spectator-friendly. So in 1882, Walter Camp, who again considered the father of football, released some rules that really changed a lot.
We took out the scrum and the universal field of all directions. We separated the teams, made a line of scrimmage, and then that led to collisions and blocking rules that changed rugby into American contact football.
Now, there were a lot of rule changes within the game, but here's a handful that were really transformative. 3 downs to go 5 yards. 5 yards really speaks to how hard it was to gain territory in the game back then. The football field was now 120 yards, meaning that there were 2 10-yard end zones and 100 yards in between. It was now 11 versus 11, and you had that line of scrimmage. And that line of scrimmage would be incredibly transformative in the way the game was played. Blocking emerged as a crucial part of the sport.
We allowed blocking instead of screening that you have and laddering in rugby. We wanted in football for the ball carrier to keep the ball and take it as far as he could. And that's what the point was. It wasn't about laddering the ball or downing it. It was about taking that thing as far as you could, and especially with, early on with the huge wedge and mob blocking you had. And man, they would just literally pick you up and throw you, your own players to get you forward. And meanwhile, the other guys are tearing you apart, So it was an amazing spectacle. It immediately attracted crowds.
The game was already attracting crowds, but it really did start to attract more crowds because it became more spectator-friendly. You had the line of scrimmage so you could see both defined sides. The play was no longer disappearing after the ball snapped underneath a pile of 20, 30, 40, 50 players. It was now 11 players per side. And the rules were simplified enough to where the game was easy to explain and easier for the uninitiated to follow. The rule changes also defined a key part of the game that players and coaches were going to have to adapt to, master, and improve upon. No matter what you wanted to do out there on the field, you needed to do 2 things and do it well: blocking and tackling. It was an essential part of the game now after these rule changes, and it's still an essential part of the game today. But Matt Janey does a really good job of explaining the effect that these rule changes back in 1882 had on the field.
So these guys start blocking, and immediately they're suffering concussion of the brain, as the term in the 1880s, or broken noses, obviously. Linemen especially. And then, of course, backs would eventually get cracked in the face. That was just a matter of time. And that really starts leading to your central theme, of course, is facial and head armament protection. That leads us into the whole new realm of collisions. But back into that block original, that's the super point, I think, is that was the original head ramming, and it remains the essential head ramming of the game that cannot be called in any fashion, poorly, well, or not. You can't deny. Simply look at what happens at the snap of the ball. These guys aren't butting their butts. They're facing off head to head in 3 and 4 point stances. So you're not going to avoid ramming head on. And they were doing that by 1883.
And that is the genesis of the football helmet. Those were the conditions of the game. Blocking, tackling happened every snap. And so injuries were occurring because of that. It was almost inevitable. And as those injuries occurred, players would do head wraps or bandaging on their head to address that injury and get back in the game and have that injury be at least a little bit protected among those conditions. But in order to reach a point where we get true head protection, the head harness that would evolve into the helmet, we would have to reach a tipping point. And that tipping point came in the form of a mass formation play called the flying wedge. Multiple sources will name multiple games that the flying wedge was first introduced in. The Wikipedia page for the first ever football game between Rutgers and Princeton says the flying wedge happened there. I'm not so sure, but I have found numerous sources that say the first ever flying wedge happened in 1892 in a game between Harvard and Yale. One such source is a book called Newton's Football, The Science Behind America's Game, It's written by Alan St. John and Anicia G. Ramirez. Really interesting book. Applies a lot of different theories and principles of science and how they work and integrate with the game of football. Good stuff if you ever want to check that out. But you can check out part of it now because I'm going to read out of it because they break down the introduction of the flying wedge into the game of football quite nicely. It goes like this. The first flying wedge took wing in 1892 in the Harvard-Yale game. Then, as is now, this was a serious rivalry, with roots that extended beyond the football field. Team considered a victory in the annual game a major point of pride. In the first half of that 1892 contest, the teams had played to a scoreless tie, which gave little indication of what was to come. But then Harvard opened the second half with a truly revolutionary play. It began with Harvard kicker Bernie Trafford executing what was the ancestor of the onside kick. Instead of kicking the ball deep, he bumped it gently and then picked it up. His teammates lined up behind him, with larger players on one side and smaller, faster ones on the other. They ran beside Trafford, forming a giant V pointed toward the Yale Bulldogs. Art Brewer, a speedy running back, trailing the play, took a handoff from Trafford, running at full speed behind his moving wedge. The mass of humanity took aim at a single member of Yale's unsuspecting defensive line, a poor sap named Alex Wallace. The flying wedge bowled over Wallace and enabled Brewer to gain 20 yards. He failed to score. A Yale alum had seen Harvard practicing the play and reported back to camp by now the Yale coach, who warned his players to focus on the ball, not Harvard's strange formation. And Yale still won the game 6-0. But with Harvard's dazzling innovation, a new brand of football was born. The flying wedge was devised by Harvard coach Loren Dellin, who was a rather unlikely innovator. A stockbroker by trade, he never played the game and didn't even see his first football game until 1890, when he was in his late 30s. But Dellin immediately recognized the parallels between the rival teams and two opposing armies in battle. The flying wedge in particular was inspired by the military thinking of Napoleon Bonaparte. I don't know if I got that pronunciation right, but bear with me. Dellin later wrote, one of the chief points brought out by the great French general was that if he could mass a single large proportion of his troops and throw them against a weak point of the enemy, he could defeat that position and, gaining their rear, create havoc with the rest. End quote. Want to take a break from this book for a second. So that's another situation where the game of football is borrowing from war. And this would go back and forth. The battle tactics will borrow from football. Football borrows from battle tactics. We're going to hear that as we go further on in the evolution of football. But from then on, more football coaches realize you can diagram plays ahead of time, and they will be effective on the field in gaining territory and getting that ball a little bit further. And because communication was key in the growth of the sport, news of the flying wedge spread fast. The New York Times described the play, quote, "What a grand play. A half-ton of bone and muscle coming into collision with a man weighing 160 or 170 pounds. A surgeon is called upon to attend to the wounded player, and the game continues with renewed brutality." End quote. Of course, a lot of people reading the New York Times, including Amos Alonzo Stagg, the famed coach of the University of Chicago at the time, he saw the potential in that play and called it, quote, "the most spectacular single formation ever." Now, sure, teams had been devising their own set plays, their own formations before the flying wedge, but the flying wedge was so powerful, so destructive, so effective that there was no looking back. In growth and evolution, once a new change is introduced that works, everything else has to adapt and adopt. And so that's what coaches did. They started drawing up similar plays. Dellin, the coach of Harvard, came up with 60 variations of that type of momentum play like the flying wedge. There were other teams that came up with similar plays. Since the flying wedge was legal, they would do things like run down the field with all their players joined at the arms so they would clothesline anything that came in their way. A specific piece of equipment was developed to more successfully make these plays, called wedge belts. Players would grab onto this belt, and that is each other's belt, not their own, and run down the field so they could mow down whatever got in their way. So, yeah, they needed to change the rules again because people were seriously getting hurt. So another round of rules alterations took place, and the flying wedge was more or less erased from the game. But the effect that the flying wedge had would change the game of football forever. Blocking and tackling were an essential part of the game, but strategically using that blocking and tackling would now be how you win the game. Now imagine what it's like to be a player during this time. You got blocking and tackling, that's a common part of the game, and so injuries from that are common. But now you have more and more teams strategizing and developing ways to have these mass formation plays designed to wear you down and run you over and run you into the ground. And when formation plays become common within the game of football, injuries start to pile up at an alarming rate. In fact, dozens of players every year are being killed playing the game of football. And so when those are the conditions, when the game is now designed to run you over, to wear you down, well, you realize pretty quickly, I either need to adapt to this or I'm going to be destroyed. And as I said at the top of the show, mankind's ability to survive, adapt, and evolve rests on the ability to invent new tools and put them to good use. So who invented the first helmet? Well, the first helmet was hair. One form of head protection that a lot of players actually thought worked was a man bun, believe it or not, growing out their hair and then doing it up nice and tight on the top of their head. And you can imagine how much protection that actually provided. Not really that much. Let's be honest, the only thing a man bun protects you from is getting laid. But actual man-made head protection, a head harness or a helmet, and by the way, a true helmet won't emerge until we get to the 1900s, but I'm going to be interchanging head harness and helmet a lot, so bear with me. The first man-made head harness or helmet, a lot of sources will credit to James Naismith. Yes, the creator of basketball, and he devised this thing to wear on your head at the same YMCA training camp that he was implementing that sport of basketball. But if you look at pictures of it, yeah, there are pictures that exist of James Naismith wearing this thing. Some sources will point out that that's not really a head harness so much as a head wrap, and a lot of other players and coaches across the country were developing similar items to wear on a head to keep a head wrap in place. You put a head wrap on your head if you got injured, got cut, and if you just had the wrap the way it was, well, that could get jostled, pulled off, and go loose. So you came up with ways to keep that head wrap in place. And so that's what a lot of people are thinking this Naismith head harness was. Just a devised piece of fabric with a chin strap designed to keep a head wrap for an injury in place while going about playing the game. Another person that's credited with coming up with one of the first helmets is Joseph Bull Reeves. Reeves was a junior at the U.S. Naval Academy when he had sustained a couple injuries throughout his football season. And the doctor at the U.S. Naval Academy told him that if he took one more hit on the head, he would, quote, this is a quote, suffer from instant insanity, end quote. Instant insanity as a medical term really speaks to where doctors were at the time. Hey, take another knock on the noggin, you'll suffer from instant insanity. So Reeves, determined to not become insane instantly or to miss his next game, went to a local shoemaker and described a design that he wanted made with the materials usually made for shoes. I want you to put this on my head and then make some ear flaps that will protect the ears. And of course, probably the shoemaker said, dude, are you insane? And Reeves said, not yet. That exchange didn't happen. Don't quote me on it. And so the bull, Joseph Reeves, was able to continue playing like a bull. Yeah, he had that nickname for a reason. And that helmet must have worked because Reeves never did suffer from insanity, instant or otherwise. In fact, he ended up graduating from the U.S. Naval Academy, went on to have a great career, and became an admiral in the Navy. He even ended up becoming known as the father of carrier aviation because of his role with aircraft carriers. He was the captain of the USS Langley in 1922, the country's first aircraft carrier, an experimental ship at the time. They built this wooden flight deck, and he developed a lot of tactics, a lot of maneuvers that are still used today with aircraft carriers. So you could give Bull Reeves credit with wearing one of the first football helmets, even kind of inventing its own design, and then going on to be an innovator with aircraft carriers, which were absolutely crucial in winning World War II in the Pacific. Another early innovator in head protection is Arthur Kamenok of Harvard. Though his contribution isn't with a helmet, it's with a face mask. That's right, the face mask was already popping up in football in the 1890s. But the helmet and the face mask wouldn't come together successfully for another few decades. Arthur J. Kamenok and his teammates were no stranger to facial and nose injuries, but you don't just want to leave the game, you want to get back in there. But you don't want to keep taking knocks on the nose, so you try and protect it. And that's why he came up with this nose guard. It's basically, think about it this way, a head strap that goes across the forehead around the back, and then dangling down from that is a larger nosed shape piece of protection that would go over the nose and then rest on the facial plate just underneath the nose. Kamenak's idea to come up with this nose mask may have come from his teammate, center John Cranston. He got an injured nose and devised a wire mask that he strapped to his face with a rubber band, and it actually kind of worked. Not only that, but he found that he was able to run headfirst into players and not really get that much more injury. So Kamenak improved on that design and actually applied for a patent in 1891. Here is the write-up that he submitted with that patent. Quote, "In playing football, although blows with the clenched hand are not permitted, it is allowable to push or ward off one's opponents with considerable force using the open hand. And in the excitement of the game, this allowable degree of force is frequently exceeded, and injuries to the face and head are not unusual. There are also sudden pushes-in effect, blows administered by the head and shoulders and elbows, and a player's nose is sometimes broken, while injuries to the mouth and forehead are less frequent and interfere less with the continuance of a game. A player whose nose is broken is prevented from further play for the time being, the prominence of that organ rendering it particularly liable to injury and suffering which any contact therewith would inevitably cause, putting such a player completely at the mercy of his opponent." End quote. So he states right there the reason why this was invented in the first place and the usefulness that something like this would have. And some of the players on the Harvard team also started wearing this mask because, yeah, it protects your nose when it's broken, but also it can prevent it from getting broken and can also help you play with a little bit more confidence, something called the compensation effect. We'll talk about that in a minute. And Kamenak would in turn sell his patent to a former professional baseball player named John F. Morrill, who had also developed his own forms of protections and sports equipment. He would then take that patent to Spalding. They would make a little bit of improvement on the design and then make sure it was in their 1891 catalog. So now we had a piece of facial protection for football players that was now open to the market. And news of this invention spread across the country and popped up in newspapers like the Birmingham Age Herald, who said, quote, "By the invention of nose armor, football players who have been hitherto barred from the field because of broken or weak noses are now able to thrust an armor-protected nose, even though it may be broken, into the center of the roughest scrimmage without danger to the sensitive nasal organ. It is said that Captain Kamenak of Harvard invented the nose armor so that Cranston, the great Harvard center rush who had a weak nose, could play with the Crimson 11. As the nose is very apt to be injured in a rough game if unprotected, the new armor is a very valuable acquisition to a football equipment." End quote. John Morrill would further develop that patent into different designs and sell those to different sporting good companies. They all kind of looked basically the same. If you're still not picturing it, they basically look like this: a strap that goes around the head at the forehead, and then a cup that dangles down from that strap over your nose. And no, not a teacup, a jockstrap cup. Yeah. And players would use them for protection if their nose was broken, but it wasn't widely adapted because there was the stigma in the game at the time. And by stigmatized, I mean players were brutally mocked for wearing head and facial protection at the time, being told they were too weak. Oh, what's the matter? You too weak to play this game? You scared? Why you got to wear protection? What's the matter? And this wasn't just coming from opposing players, it was coming from fans too. You didn't want to be seen as weak, especially in a game like football. But also, you can imagine when you have this big rubber jockstrap cup-looking thing over your nose, it's hard to breathe and it gets hot. And also, there was no face mask rule at the time, so kind of anything goes with that. They could just grab it and tackle you by that nose guard or rip it off your face, and sometimes that hurts worse than just taking an old bump on the schnoz. So let's pause and reflect on something real quick. Obviously, there's a little bit of overlap between plays like the flying wedge coming into action and the development of head and facial protection in the game of football. But we have 1892. This is the year that Arthur J. Kamenak of Harvard's nose mask comes to the market. Now, we've already heard about Kamenak and other players on Harvard realizing the effectiveness of this nose mask and starting to wear it because it helped them play a little bit better, a little bit more fearless. Now, Kamenak graduated from Harvard in 1891, so he wasn't on the 1892 squad, but now we know that there were most likely a good amount of players using that nose mask on the Harvard team in 1892, the same year that they implemented the flying wedge. Now, when you're implementing a strategy from Napoleon that allows you to plow through your opponent, and you have access to a nose mask that is advertised to enable you to fearlessly plow into your opponent, well, you can see how those two kind of go together, don't you? So now we know this time head protection, facial protection was part of commercial sales in sports equipment. The A.G. Spalding Company was publishing catalogs that had variations of head protection for football, one of them being the number 15 and the number 25 helmet. That didn't provide much protection on the top of the head, but it was to protect from cauliflower ear. So there was padding that would go over the ears with holes cut in the fabric, and there was also a nose guard that would come down in the front. Now, the number 15 and the number 25 models of that helmet were basically the same, but if you bought the number 15, you had to pick which ear would be protected. If you wanted both ears protected, you had to buy the number 25, which was 50 cents extra. Number 15 model, $2 at the time, which adjusted for inflation, $2.1895, will cost you $70 today in 2022. And if you wanted protection on both ears, well, you're going to have to pay an extra $18. $88 is what a number 25 Spalding headset would cost you in today's money. So I bring up the number 25 helmet being sold by Spalding at the time because it's very similar to a helmet invented by a college football player named George Barclay. Now, Barclay's story is an interesting one when it comes to the evolution of the football helmet. And Barclay played for a school called Lafayette College. Heard of it? Yeah, it's not that big of a school, not that popular of a program. And they were playing in a division with schools like Yale, Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, Syracuse, Harvard, big powerhouse schools. Some of those schools were there at the very beginning of football. And George Barclay had the nickname of Rose. He had that nickname not just because he was smaller than a lot of other players playing at the time, just under 160 pounds, shorter than 6 feet, but because he was a good-looking guy and popular with the ladies. And I'm being serious here. You look at his pictures, this guy looks like a really handsome Christian Bale. I'm talking Newsies, young Christian Bale, not the machinist Christian Bale.
What the are you doing?
Well, I'm comparing you to another good-looking dude and saying you're good-looking. Relax.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, it is good for me.
You're a nice guy. You're a nice guy.
Thanks, Christian Bale. So Barclay, good-looking guy, popular with the ladies, so much so that his nickname is Rose. Looking around at all these football players that he's playing with and seeing how ugly they are from injuries, from getting beat up in the game, and thinks, I don't want to end up looking like that. This becomes a case of coming up with protection not to protect an injury that's already there, but to prevent injury, to prevent ugliness. And he goes to a local saddle maker with this design in mind and comes up with this head harness that loops down around the ears, goes over the top of the head, and does a good job of protecting from things like cauliflower ear or being so busted, ugly, and gross that you can't pick up the prettiest ladies at the Lafayette College campus. And another thing that we need to now bring up is something called compensatory behavior. It comes up in the book Newton's Football. It says, quote, "A phenomenon called compensatory behavior explains why safety devices don't always work as their designers predict. The theory suggests that people will have a preset tolerance for risk, and that if a safety device lowers the perceived risk, the individual will, perhaps subconsciously, modify his or her behavior to reach that internal threshold. In other words, when some device makes you feel safe, you're more likely to behave recklessly. The brain outsources the job of protecting the body to the device, impairing good judgment. For example, drivers behind the wheel of a large SUV with four-wheel drive and airbags tend to drive faster and more aggressively on snowy roads than they would if they were driving a tiny old economic car. A football player with a helmet feels well protected, perhaps even invincible, and will tackle you in ways that he wouldn't even consider with a bare head." End quote. And we're going to be seeing plenty of examples of compensatory behavior phenomenon as we explore new improvements on the helmet throughout history. George Barclay's case is one of those. You get a guy who's a little bit smaller than everybody else, but is always tasked with actually running the ball because he's speedy, and he also doesn't want to mess up his looks. So when you're worried about your size, you're worried about getting hurt and messing up your looks, you play a little bit timid, you play it a little bit safe. You're not willing to take as many risks. But when you're wearing something like a head harness, and you created this head harness with the purpose of playing with less fear, playing less timid, and being less worried about getting hurt, well, then you can play a little bit better. And that's when a piece of protection now gives you an advantage in the game. And look, coaches, players, their skills, they all play a factor here, but there's a notable difference once this helmet comes into play. The numbers do not lie.
And how was it?
Lafayette College from 1889 all the way up to 1896 didn't have very good seasons. 3-4-2 in 1899, a record of 2-5-1 in 1890, 2-9-1 in 1891. The best record they had was in 1895 with 6-2. But in 1896, that was a completely different looking team. A dominant one, highlighted with accomplishments like games against Penn. They were going against the University of Pennsylvania, who had not lost a game in 3 years. They were down 4-0 going into the second half, and late in the game, heroics by none other than Barclay and his fearlessness, charging ahead and then charging ahead again from 10 yards all the way into the end zone, put his team ahead, and they ended up winning that game 6-4. Over a span of 6 years, from 1893 all the way up to 1900, the University of Pennsylvania, Penn, the Quakers, would play 66 games and attain a record of 65-1. That one in the loss column belongs to Barclay, his head harness, and the Lafayette College Leopards. That one win against Penn is such a big deal that it is the first time a quote-unquote small school has beaten one of the big four: Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Penn. Barclay and the Leopards had such a dominant season that they outscored their opponents 240-10. They only allowed 10 points against all season, only letting their opponent score against them in 2 games, and that was the game against Penn and a game against Navy. Shut out every other team that they played. They finished the season with an 11-0-1 record. The one was a tie against Princeton. It was a 0-0 tie, which was also a big surprise and a big deal for such a small school. Let's list off the national champions from 1890 to 1899, and you tell me who stands out. 1890, Harvard. 1891, Yale. 1892, Yale. 1893, Princeton. 1894, Yale. 1895, Penn. 1896, Lafayette, Princeton. 1897, Penn. 1898, Harvard. 1899, Harvard. Yep. It's the head harness wearing Lafayette College Leopards busting up the party that the Big Four were having as national champions. Now, you may be trying to bust up this case saying one guy with one head harness isn't going to make that much of a difference to make an 11-0-1 season. But look, this guy was the running back. And also, if you look at pictures from Lafayette College playing in the 1896 season, he's not the only one wearing the head harness. Most of the team is. So that means in an era where wearing head protection was stigmatized and looked down upon, these guys were willing to risk that just to put on a helmet. So it must have provided some protection and some kind of advantage if other players on the team were willing to adopt it as well.
I'm not asking, I'm telling you. You wouldn't have done that otherwise.
I do want to make a note about one thing here with that national championship title. Look, an 11-0-1 record is mighty impressive. The fact that you had a shutout in 10 of your 12 games is very impressive. Outscoring your opponent 240-10 is very impressive, and it does really earn you that title. But college football didn't have an actual national championship game to decide a national champion until the end of the 20th century. So up until that point, national champions were named retroactively by committees or influential people. Princeton and the Lafayette College Leopards would be named national champions of 1896 retroactively in the early 1930s when a football guide was published, and that guide was written by Park Davis. Park Davis was the head coach of the Lafayette College Leopards in 1896, and he's a Princeton alumni. So just take that for what it's worth. After Lafayette College had a season that shocked the college football world, well, the head harness, or some version of it, started to catch on elsewhere. I'm not necessarily saying that's solely because of Barclay and his head harness. They were available in catalogs at this point, but at this point, a lot of people were starting to realize not only does it offer protection, but it might also offer a little bit of an advantage. More and more players were starting to wear these head harnesses, and they were starting to take shape in different forms. I mentioned earlier Joseph Bull Reeves and his shoe sole leather helmet. That's a hard thing to have on top of your head. Other players started to have these hard sole leather padding on top of their helmet, or paper mache, something hard to go on top of their helmet, and now they started diving with their head into players. It got to the point where in the early 1900s, in 1902, when Walter Camp and the Rules Committee started to meet about some rule changes, one of them was going to be to ban these pieces of headgear that had hard leather, and maybe some of them that even came to a point, some of them that were made out of paper mache. Head harnesses were going to have to change because players were starting to use them to their advantage and starting to shape them and make them to be used as a weapon on the football field. So this would cause the rules to change yet again. And there was a division between people who wanted helmets completely gone from the game and from a lot of people who thought that head harnesses and versions of the helmet did protect players and that this was one of the avenues that they could take if they develop it properly and regulate it properly to make the game safer and to reduce injury and reduce the amount of fatalities that was going on at the time. The Rules Committee met in 1902, 1903. They came out with new rule changes, and among those were a ban in specific types of helmets, among some other rule changes designed in opening up the game a little bit. So at the beginning of this 1903 season, you had a company like Spalding who was holding off on releasing a new catalog and releasing a new helmet in it, just to see how the rules were going to shake out. And the new restrictions placed on helmets opened up the door for an invention from somebody who has had quite the influence in the sports world and someone who's going to be in one of our future episodes of How Gear Changed the Game, Julian Curtis. Curtis is credited with developing the basketball with James Camp, and he's also credited with bringing golf to America. He was over in the British Isles buying some leather that he was going to turn into footballs, saw the game of golf, saw all this golf equipment, bought a bunch of it at a discount, brought it over, instituted it at places like Yale, started having golf courses built, and that took off from there. He also designed some other sports equipment, but one thing he designed for football was something called the pneumatic helmet. The pneumatic helmet was different than all the head harnesses worn at the time. It didn't have this sole leather, it didn't have these typical ear flaps. Instead, it kind of looked like a beehive that would come down on top of the head, and at the very top, around the top, was this inflatable tube. That was the pneumatic part of the pneumatic helmet. See, the Rules Committee was trying to ban hard top helmets. Well, what's softer than air, right? And the idea was that it would lessen the blow from impact. It didn't really do that much in hindsight, but the entire Yale team of 1903 wore those helmets, and they ended up having quite the season. The record that year was 11-1. They only gave up points to opponents in 3 of those 12 games. The one loss that they had was November 14th against Princeton. And maybe it was bad luck from a new invention that day that caused them to lose. Thomas Edison had this idea of motion pictures. Shooting multiple pictures within a second and then quickly flipping through all of them gave it motion. So he had these motion picture cameras go and shoot this game. And it would not be the last time that cameras would have an influence in the game of football. And in the footage from that game, you can see all the players for Yale wearing this pneumatic helmet. Now, it's hard to say if the pneumatic helmet really had a role in Yale doing so well that year. They were already a really good football team and a really good conference. Again, Yale is one of the big 4 teams that was dominating college football at the time. And also, the pneumatic helmet was too ahead of its time in this era. It didn't have the intended effect because of some other design flaws, and thus the pneumatic helmet and the idea of it would go away for another couple of decades. Now, a quick footnote about the involvement of the pneumatic helmet, Julian Curtis, the Spalding Company, Yale, and Walter Camp. Walter Camp and Julian Curtis knew each other. Curtis was a graduate of Yale before going on to become the president of the Spalding Company, and Walter Camp had some input in the design, and this is a guy who had just overhauled the rules to ban certain types of helmets. So I'm not going to list out any conspiracy theories or anything that I think may have happened here, but it's at least worth stating the fact that Curtis and Camp knew each other and that Yale was directly involved with an alumni who was in charge of developing sports equipment. Either way, teams were now realizing that the helmet was an effective and useful tool. It did protect players, and that's a benefit. Reducing injuries, being able to play without fear of getting your skull cracked open, those are pretty big advantages, right? So the sporting goods equipment is starting to expand. There's different types of head harness models coming out, as well as other pads on the shoulders, the hips, the thighs, and things of that nature. And the game itself is growing a little bit. But even with better protection, a more open game, and a little bit of rule changes, the injuries are still starting to pile up, as well as the fatalities. It was a catch-22 of compensatory behavior. The more protected players were, the more reckless they could play. In the first 5 years of the 20th century, football was brutal. You had specific games being called out as notable moments in history where lots of players were hurt or killed. From 1900 to 1905, there were 45 deaths among football players. 18 deaths in 1905 alone. On November 25th, 1905, 3 players died in just that day. Things were reaching a critical mass. Now, also in 1905, away from the football field up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, Teddy Roosevelt was negotiating a peace treaty between Russia and Japan, who were at war at the time, and he successfully did so, would end up winning a Nobel Peace Prize for it. 1 month after that treaty was signed, he would again be bringing rivals together in order to stop unnecessary violence and death. Teddy Roosevelt decided to step in and save the game of football because a lot of players were getting hurt. A lot of players were dying, and he brought folks in like Walter Camp and said, look, you got to come up with some rules that are going to make this game safer, because Roosevelt, like many people, believed at the time that football was necessary for national security because it not only helped us brainstorm different tactics that we could go and borrow and use in battle, but it also toughened up young men. And if you had people across the country, young men across the country, playing football, getting toughened up and learning these tactics and learning the value of teamwork, should America end up in a war, we would be ready for it. So the Rules Committee got to work. This little step into football history by Teddy Roosevelt would be the catalyst in creating what is now known as the NCAA. It would also spur one of the biggest overhauls in rules in the history of football. Part of the big rule changes that were implemented in 1906 was the introduction of the forward pass. And yeah, it was made legal for safety concerns or whatever, but the rule makers put in stipulations that made the forward pass a huge risk. For example, if a pass was less than 5 yards from the center of the line of scrimmage, it was a turnover at the spot of the pass. And keep in mind, the ball shape was different back then, so it was harder to throw a good pass. If a ball was passed across the goal line into the end zone for a catch, it was a touchback, not a touchdown. You had to get your touchdowns the hard way, by plowing through a bunch of people trying to tackle you and hurt you. If the pass ball hit the ground without anyone touching it, it was a turnover to the other team at the spot of that pass. If a pass ball went out of bounds, yeah, that was also a turnover. That's a lot of limits on the forward pass, right? Yeah, but there's more. A limit of 20 yards was placed on how far you could pass it. Well, if you had more than one incomplete pass in a series of downs, that was another penalty. And it was also legal to tackle a receiver while the ball was in the air before he even had a chance to catch it. Which means that as soon as the ball is thrown, if you're on the other team, you can tackle that receiver, watch the ball hit the ground without anybody touching it, and then, ta-da, the ball is yours. So if you're a coach, you're not going to do the forward pass even though it's legal, because it's just too risky. And again, the ball isn't shaped the way it is today. It's harder to throw an accurate pass. It's harder to throw a good spiral. Now, eventually, the forward pass would be utilized successfully by Pop Warner, the Carlisle School, but that didn't really just come down to somebody deciding, well, actually, the forward pass is useful. That was really in the hands of the fact that Jim Thorpe is one of the greatest athletes that the world has ever known. He was the quarterback for that Carlisle Indian School, and he is the one that showed the world that, yes, the forward pass can be done, if you're as good as me. There were lots of critics of these rule changes, especially the forward pass. Lots of people said, it just makes the game softer. There's even an editorial cartoon that we have on howgearchangedthegame.com that shows 2 men wearing women's clothing out on the football field looking at one another, and some mocked up rules sitting on the field as well that say football rules 1906, no pinching, no slapping, hug easy, don't yell, no nose pulling, don't bite. Yeah. You could say that some people were afraid the game was going to get too soft. Did it? Well, there were 18 deaths in the game of football in 1905. In 1907, there were 14 fatalities. I believe there were 11 fatalities in the game of football in 1906. Roosevelt came back furious that not enough was done to enforce this new code to make the game a little bit safer, but this time, the blame was directed not at the official games and those official rules, but sandlot football, where the conditions were shoddy and the rules were rarely enforced. The Journal for the American Medical Association said that another reason for blame is that young boys playing the game, as well as young men who are not fit to play against their larger counterparts. They concluded that they cannot stop the game from being played or from growing, but, quote, if we must have this gladiatorial sport, would it not be better to adopt gladiatorial methods and have the game played only by fully developed men who have passed a severe physical examination before beginning the course of training? End quote. So while the game was slowly changing on the field due to the changes of rules and the changes of equipment, certain conditions of the game just weren't changing. Blocking and tackling were still at the core of what the game was all about, and the injuries and fatalities only fluctuated a small amount. In 1912, the game was still about brute force and power. Though more set plays and formations had started to emerge, we now had the forward pass, there was more gear, we now had padded shoulders, even though it was just extra padding sewn in or leather. There were hip pads, thigh pads, knee pads. It was still a rough game, and the objective was still simple. Run them over, wear them down. Ernest Pott Graves was the coach of the Army football team in 1912, and he was quoted, when asked why he employed such a brutal style of play, as pointing to a steamroller that was outside his window and saying, "There is my idea of football." And a lot of coaches felt that way. Football was a rough sport, physically punishing to those who played it, and the coaches wanted to employ that style. And even though it was designed to wear their opponents down, that is in effect going to wear down their own players. And from a player perspective, if that's the conditions of the game and it's physically punishing, well, you might as well wear some pads that reduce that punishment just a little bit. And that enabled lots of sporting good companies to jump in on the action, develop variations of equipment. At this time, there wasn't just one head harness. You didn't have to go and invent your own. There was multiple styles you could buy, all that came in a catalog. And while there were different variations of the helmet, they were all kind of the same. It started to change from the old Larwood helmet design, which was kind of a 4-point spoke system that went across the top of the head, down to a strap that went around at the forehead to the back, and then loops down around the ears. That was developed by a man named Larwood, and that patent sold to Spalding. But now helmets were starting to be completely enclosed. The leather would stretch all the way around the head, all the way over the ears. Players didn't always like it because it was a little hot. They made holes for ventilation, for better hearing. But the fact is that even if you covered the whole head in leather, there wasn't really an improvement going on there. It didn't really lessen the impact any more than some of these old head harness models. That would change in 1917. Let's talk about one of the greatest coaches in the history of the University of Illinois and the Fighting Illini football team, Robert Zuppke. Well, okay, we'll talk about him just after a short break. In 1917, after the football season had concluded, in Champaign, Illinois, Robert Zuppke, head coach of the University of Illinois and the Fighting Illini, was giving a speech to his graduating players. He said, quote, "Why is it that just when you players are beginning to know something about football after 3 years, I lose you and you stop playing? It makes no sense. Football is the only sport that ends a man's career just when it should be beginning." End quote. And one of the players in the audience that day was George Halas. And Halas said that this speech was a pivotal moment in his life and inspired him to do a lot of things that he did from that point forward. Halas would be one heck of an innovator when it comes to the game of football, not just the creation of the NFL or owning the Chicago Bears, coming up with all-star games, or just his overall prickly personality, but a lot of other innovations that we'll talk about next episode. Zuppke was one heck of an innovator himself and one heck of a creative person, both on the field and off. He would usher in all kinds of innovations in football: the long snap, the screen pass, the huddle, the flea flicker, the flying trapeze. And man, I hope he came up with those names himself. An interesting guy, and not just for his football brilliance. He was a talented painter and very prolific because he created a lot of paintings. Rarely did he paint football scenes, but there is a good football painting that is hanging in Illini coach Lovie Smith's office right now called The Benchwarmer. He painted cacti in Southwest deserts, snow-covered mountains of Colorado, has some nice paintings of Cuba during his time coaching there when we were actually still on good terms with Cuba. And during his time there, he struck up a friendship with Ernest Hemingway. That's right. You got to be pretty cool to be friends with Ernest Hemingway. And actually, Zupke almost coached Hemingway at Oak Park High School. Hemingway played on the football team at Oak Park, and Zupke was a coach for the Oak Park High School. But Zupke left to go coach Illinois the same year that Hemingway began playing on that team. Just missed him by a year. Maybe it was for the best. Zupke applied his art to his work as well. He was quoted as saying, quote, "A painting is a creation, and so is a football team. Just as an artist creates a picture on a canvas, a football coach creates a mobile image out of an array of raw physical masses. Just as paintings are made of dabs and swabs of different pigments, so football compositions are an orderly conglomeration of different types of men in motion. In selecting the men who compose my teams, I always follow this maxim: pick heat and motion." End quote. That motion is going to be the key to his success, not only in winning games, but coming up with strategies and formations that would take the football world by storm and be adapted across the board by a lot of people. Now, you know this had to go somewhere with gear, right? Yeah, Zupke wasn't just an innovator when it came to plays and fleet flickers and flying trapezes and paintings. Well, he was also using his drawing skills to come up with blueprints. In 1917, the world would be introduced to the Zupke helmet, and it was different than any helmet that had come before it because of a thing called suspension. Up until this time, helmets had rested right on top of the head, and maybe there would be a little bit of extra padding in the lining in between your skull and the leather that would come in the form of cotton or wool, and that would soften the impact a little bit, but as you can imagine, it didn't do all that much. Still better than the alternative, which is nothing at all, but still, it's not really helping you absorb a huge amount of impact. But what he did was devise a system of straps that held the helmet a little bit off the surface of the head. It created space between the top of your head and the inside of the helmet, so it would absorb a lot of that impact, and it would lessen the blows that you were taking snap after snap significantly more than any other helmet that was available on the market. There was also airflow going through there because you had that separation between the head and the helmet, so that added a little bit of a cooling effect and made it way more comfortable on top of a substantial increase in the protection from impact. This simple design was night and day from other helmets. Creating a helmet that can sustain impact way better than anything else before it makes a lot of sense coming from Zupke. Not just because it was creative, but because it demanded a style of play that called for high velocity impact. Remember, heat and motion. To back that up, here's some quotes from Zupke's 1923 book, Football, Techniques and Tactics. Quote, "Some players merely hug or embrace an opponent or attempt to grab him. A good tackler tries to hurl his weight into the opponent with the thought in mind of throwing him or driving him back, not merely holding him. A good tackler eyes the spot he wishes to strike and enjoys the anticipation of contact. He has the spirit that compels him to drive into his opponent as hard and as soon as possible. A courageous tackler will charge his head and shoulders directly at an opponent." End quote. So yeah, the guy not only expects you to tackle hard, but do it fearlessly and actually do it with a sense of joy. Zupke is known for implementing the I formation. And it may have been used before, maybe he didn't invent it, but he did it so well that most people assume that he did. Some credit the I formation to Charles Hollister of Northwestern in 1900. Zupke, while coaching at Oak Park, saw a lot of University of Chicago games that were coached by innovator Amos Alonzo Stagg, and a few people believe that Zupke borrowed a lot of plays from Stagg and improved upon them. So maybe that's where the I formation came from. But either way, when Zupke implemented it, starting in 1914 when he went to Illinois, it started to work pretty well. With the I formation, you had your tackles lining up on the line of scrimmage, but behind the center was the quarterback. Behind the quarterback was the fullback, and behind the fullback was the halfback. And you had the option to throw a wide receiver over to one side or the other. So that right there gave the quarterback options, but also he believed by placing people a little bit further back from that line of scrimmage, it gave them more room to get in motion, to build up speed, to bring the heat with that motion. And a lot of times the fullback, who was directly behind the quarterback and in front of the halfback, would work as the blocker. Some teams were using the tight end at the end of the line of scrimmage to do the blocking for them, but with the fullback, Gaining full motion from being further back at the line of scrimmage and running in front of the halfback, they had more momentum to plow people down that tried to tackle that halfback behind them. And the I formation was pretty darn successful almost right away. 1913 was Zupke's first season coaching at Illinois. He got a 4-2-1 record that year and went 2-2-1 in the conference. But in 1914, how many games did he lose? 0. 7-0 the overall record, 6-0 in the conference, which was good enough to be named national champions of 1914. The following year, didn't lose in regulation, had a 5-0-2 record, 3-0-2 in the conference, tied for first in the Big Ten Conference, and shared that conference title. So it's safe to say the I formation was working, and it works great when you have experienced football players who can adapt to the strategies you want to do, but also have the wherewithal, the size, and the strength of typical football players to pull this stuff off. But what if you don't have any of that? Well, in 1917, you know that speech I was talking about that Zupke gave? There was a little bit more context to just players graduating and them going away and their football careers over. Because at that time, it was clear that the U.S. was going to be sending a lot of troops over to Europe to fight in this war that was going on. We now know it as World War I. But he was losing not only graduating players, but guys like George Halas, who enlisted, ended up going to the Great Lakes Naval Facility and playing on the football team there. And with all these players leaving, that left Zupke with next to nothing. He had about 50 players show up for tryouts in 1918, and they sucked. Even the papers leading up to this 1918 season kept talking about how this Illinois team of 1918 was going to be inexperienced, undersized, and completely outmatched in every single game that they're going to play. An article that I believe is from the Associated Press, but I found it in the Cincinnati Commercial Tribune newspaper from October 12th, 1918 says, quote, "Only about 20 men donned uniforms last night, and these were given practice consisting entirely of punting and drops and place kicking. Zupke is resorting to this because he expects the team that faces the Jackies next Saturday to be on the defensive, as the squad will average less than 168 pounds per man. Another cause for worry is the great amount of fumbling, which seems to be as contagious as the flu. Ralph Fletcher, last year's halfback, was in line the first time in 2 weeks." End quote. This is where the helmet comes in just a little bit. It doesn't mention it specifically or outright, but let's think about this here. We just learned that in Zupke's book, he expects his players to be excited about contact. They should want contact. We know that Zupke wants men in motion. He wants that momentum, so that means higher velocity impacts. So when you want players to be excited about contact and to be in motion and really start plowing down players and do something like the I formation, which is brutal to do play after play, as opposed to these short distance single wing offense that's really just collisions right at the line of scrimmage. Everybody is going from a 3 or 4 point stance directly into one another instead of being 5-10 yards back, running in an all out sprint, and then having the collision. So isn't it just a great coincidence that this coach who created a helmet that significantly lessens the damage and pain that you feel from impact when he expects high velocity impact? He expects you to run fearlessly ahead because the game counts on that fearlessness. And we talked about compensatory behavior. Yeah, well, this might come into play here. When you're working under a coach that has an innovative strategy and you're using equipment from an innovative coach that is innovative in itself, well, the two hand in hand can help you out a lot. This team that was expected to have a terrible season in 1918 because they were undersized and inexperienced, well, they went 5-2, went undefeated in the conference in 1918. Now, 1918 was also a unique season, and this will happen again in the 1940s, because since it was wartime, military bases had football teams that were competing in college conferences. The only 2 games that Illinois lost were against military-based teams. October 12th against the Great Lakes Naval Facility, and that team included George Halas and a couple of players who may or may not have been pro, and that may or may not have been a controversy in the papers that week. They lost 0-7. They also played the Chicago Naval Reserve at the same field at Illinois Field in Champaign, Illinois, lost 0-7. From that point forward, the Illini didn't give up a single point. In fact, There were only 2 games where the Illini gave up points against, and those were those 2 military-based games. Everything else, they won 19-0, 22-0, 13-0, 29-0. Of the 7 games that they played that year, they outscored their opponents 86-14. It was the first time since 1910 that an Illinois team had allowed 0 points against from any team within their conference. And that team of 1918 that was inexperienced and expected to just be on defense the whole time, while their defense was perfect. So that tackling must have been pretty gosh darn effective. And, obviously their offense was very effective too, but Zupke is an incredible coach. He not only helps players rise to the occasion, whips them in shape, but he has the strategy to back it up. It's the full equation here, but this Zupke helmet is a big part of that. Think about being a player going into battle with Zupke, and he's expecting a lot out of you physically, and you have to do it snap after snap. Again, this isn't 2-platoon football. You're playing on both sides of the ball. So it helps to have a helmet that helps you play a little bit more fearless, but also reduces the wear and tear on you from having high velocity impact snap after snap. Also in 1918, Zupke wasn't just running the I formation, he was also running variations of the T formation, which some also believe started with Amos Alonzo Stagg back at University of Chicago. But we're going to talk about the T formation next episode when we get into the weeds on a guy named Clark Shaughnessy and a guy named George Halas. Now, in 1919, the war would end and Zupke would get some very big, very talented players back on his roster, and they would win the national championship with a 6-1 record. But it's worth noting also that travel was restricted in 1919. All of the games were within the conference. That was because of the flu going on and a little bit of a fuel shortage. But this 1918 season sticks out because it was just a bunch of random schmoes off the street, more or less. And those players did rise to the occasion. And one player was named to the All-American team, and some of them were named to the second All-American team. And they ended up doing quite well for themselves. But it was the helmet that was a significant factor in the success of that season and that conference title. It was a team that shouldn't have accomplished anything at all. But Zupke and his creations, he had a lot of them at play here. The I formation got accolades, some of the players got accolades, but people even then took note of the role the helmet had in that success and in those victories. The Zupke design of the helmet would soon be sold nationwide as the Spalding Company jumped all over that and acquired the rights to sell it, and it would be sold under the model of ZH, Zupke Helmet. And with that, the sale of football helmets really started to take off, and the Leatherhead era was in full swing. Now, Robert Zupke didn't invent the Leatherhead era. Leather helmets existed before his simple innovation, but that simple idea of fabric suspension within a helmet took all the good things about the leather helmet and improved upon all the criticisms about a leather helmet, tied it all together into something that truly worked and that was truly beneficial to the game of football, the players who played it and the coaches who coached it. And that's why it took off. And Zupke would not just play for the one team of Spalding, he actually ended up with his name on some other patents, like hip pads for Rawlings. And what a time to capitalize, as sporting goods equipment was taking off. As we enter the roaring 20s, business in America was booming. And so was the business of football. Both on the field as college football programs started to expand, the National Football League, or the early version of it, would begin around this time, which we'll go deeper into next episode. It was more common on the field now to see players wearing a helmet. So if you're a player or a coach that finally decides, all right, I need to get some kind of helmet too, well, here comes the hard part. In 1920, there are a lot of different choices and a lot of different catalogs. But thumb through them, and here is what you'll find in 1920. There's the 4-strap head harness, named so for its 4 straps. Wow! 4 straps going from the middle top of your head down to the right and left, to the front and back, that joins up with a belt that goes around your forehead to the back and ear flaps hanging down. You had the 8-spoke head harness, which was basically the same as the 4-strap head harness, but twice as many spokes and straps. You had the rain cap. It was a full covering dome that went down to just above the temples and had ear flaps hanging down. You had the flat top head harness, which looked a little bit like a beehive with a flat top on the top of it, you had the Princeton flat top, a variation of the flat top head harness that was worn by, yeah, you guessed it, Princeton. And of course, Harvard can't have Princeton wearing their own flat top head harness that they'll market and make money off of. So we had the Harvard flat top head harness. There was also the molded crown head harness, which was a little bit like the rain cap. It was molded around the head, provided a little bit more protection in the back of the head, but fully covered your head and had ear flaps hanging down as well. You had the Western style head harness, which was very similar to the molded crown head harness, but had some of those spoke straps on top of the leather going all the way around your head. There was the 4-strap reinforced head harness, which again was very similar in that it had leather going all the way around the front of the forehead, all the way over the top of your head, all the way to the back, and had ear flaps hanging down with the chin strap. And because there were so many different types of head harnesses being sold at the time, sporting goods companies started to try and address different types of injuries around the head because why not? So we saw really weird variations to the helmet. There were nose protectors at the time that was really just a giant leather flap that came down from the forehead portion of the helmet and went down to just below the cheekbones. It looked like a nightmare-inducing World War I version of the Batman helmet. It had a peak right in front of the nose, little slots for eyes, but obviously, that got really hot, and just a piece of leather under your nose didn't provide that much protection, and it also took away your peripheral vision, so you can imagine why that didn't catch on. There were other versions of this that were even bigger and more robust, so you can imagine the same look of, if you're familiar with Mad Magazine or Mad TV, Spy vs. Spy, it looked a lot like that, where you had almost a beak that was coming off the front of the helmet. Obviously, that did not last long either, because it was hot, it was uncomfortable, didn't provide that much protection. So while the idea of helmets were growing and the idea of facial protection attached to the helmet was being introduced more and more in a number of different ways, it wasn't quite ready to catch on, for obvious reasons. Everything was booming in America in the 1920s, and everything was feeding off of one another and each other's success. Now, as Matt Cheney established a little bit earlier on, transportation and communication are always key to growth. The 1920s brought on a huge leap forward in communication and technology with the implementation of the radio. Suddenly, families were gathering around this box plugged into the wall at night and being transported away out of their home, out of their city, to places like New York City, a town they never thought that they would visit. Radio was such a powerful thing that you had cases like Navin R. Johnson in Mississippi hearing a broadcast from St. Louis and thinking, this tells me that there's this whole world out there. This music is telling me that I could go and be somebody. But on a lower level, it also made it to where you didn't have to wait for the paper to hear scores. And you had innovators like KDKA Radio, which was the first commercial radio station in all of America. I'm proud to say that I'm the great-great-grandson of the person who sang the national anthem on the first ever broadcast of KDKA Radio in November of 1920. 1 year later, KDKA Radio would make history again by broadcasting a baseball game. 1 month later, they broadcasted a football game. That's a huge game changer. Because if you couldn't go to the game and watch it in person, you had to wait to get the updates and the scores in the newspaper. Now, you could listen to the game in real time without even being in the city it was taking place in. Now, that's commonplace now. We watch on our mobile devices, but back then, that was huge. And that did wonders for growing all of the team sports. You could listen to a game as it happened. So when you're a young man listening to the radio, listening to these teams and thinking, well, this tells me that there's a whole world out there and that I could play football too and go and be somebody. So the popularity of the game started to grow exponentially. But this was an interesting era for the game of football. Different types of plays, new leagues emerging, new ways of communication and transportation, and new ways of players donning equipment as they took to the field. The helmet had already come together to become a more complete, perfect piece that was better than it ever was before with the innovations that Zupke had introduced, and then it was slightly improved year after year every time there was a new catalog. But another big new invention came along for helmets in the mid-1920s, and that was the introduction of the fiber reinforced helmet. It was a harder piece of all I can read in the research is that it was fiber reinforced. It made it harder. They polished the helmets on the exterior better so it would be a little bit more slick. That allowed for, better hitting. Heads wouldn't get kind of pushed to one side or the other and could slide off. It did a little bit to reduce injury by reducing the friction a little bit. But the introduction of the fiber reinforced helmet, it first started right at the front of the forehead, because as we talk about, again, blocking right on that line of scrimmage, the ball snaps, you explode forward into your opponent, and you're driving that front of the head into your opponent. So when it's just leather and it's suspended, yeah, it provides a little bit of protection, but now the fiber reinforced helmet added this harder shell so you could drive forward harder, you could hit harder, and face less repercussion when it comes to an impact being brought onto you. So, of course, that was adopted very quickly. The NFL started using it. Different college teams started using it. So we're getting to the end of the 1920s where everything is a lot better than it was at the beginning of the decade. We've all got cars, we've all got radios, our helmets are hard, our bellies are full, but what goes up must come down. The stock market crashes in 1929, and everybody feels the hurt from that, including the game of football. Some sporting good manufacturers would go out of business. The new NFL would be in trouble. Players were leaving because they needed to go make real money with real job. You had one player leaving the Plymouth team to go have a wrestling career, which paid more at the time. The Plymouth Steamroller, which was a member of that league, was in so much trouble. They were in $17,000 worth of debt in 1930. If you adjust for inflation, that's over $300,000 worth of debt today. So the Plymouth Steamroller decided they were going to form themselves a corporation and sell some shares publicly to try and raise money against that debt, so people could become shareholders in a professional sports team. In the long run, it didn't work out, and the Steamroller ended up moving to Detroit, where they became the Detroit Lions. Now, another team tried this strategy too, going public, making their fans shareholders so that they had a stake in the success of the team and could actually keep the team in existence. That one worked. That was the Green Bay Packers. Now, I bring up the stock market crash, the Great Depression, not just to talk about teams that didn't make it, but because of the effect it had on football at a smaller level. Because the Great Depression brought about the New Deal. The New Deal was meant to bring us out of the Great Depression by bolstering the infrastructure of America and spending lots of money building up new things and giving people jobs building those new things. In a lot of small towns across America, they thought the best way to spend that infrastructure money was to build up stadiums at their high schools. Now, it wasn't just because of high school football that they did this. It was because it was an obvious choice. You had all the roads. Interstates wouldn't become a thing until after World War II. But if you could build this stadium, it became a facility for things other than football. So it wasn't just a choice based on football. I want to make that clear. But the fact is that with this New Deal money going into building high school football stadiums, even though there was more than one intended purpose, high school football became an economic pillar of a lot of small towns across the country. Here's a quote from the book No Game for Boys to Play. Quote, "Yet even such depictions acknowledge the big business aspect of football in these communities. For instance, the 1946 profile of the White Plains, New York football team opened by observing the enormous economic influence of the sport by saying, elevation of football at the White Plains High School to virtually a college level, with adults thronging the $2.5 million stadium, has given the sport such fiscal status that it is the chief support of all extracurricular activities." End quote. Now, football economically supporting other sports within a program happens in college sports to this day. That's just part of it. But when you have high school football that is at the economic center of small towns, that's what's supporting Main Street. That's what's supporting those town squares that grew to such a big prominent thing from the end of the 1930s all the way to the 1950s, because that was the big game. Friday night, everybody came out to go to the game, which brought people out on the town. It brought visitors in from out of town to go to these games. There were ticket sales at the booth. There were people going out to eat afterwards. There were people shopping beforehand. High school football was the main economic driver in a lot of small towns because it brought people out and it brought money out of people's pockets. And when the team was good, business was good. When a team is bad, business is not as good. Imagine that kind of pressure on a group of teenage kids. Imagine that kind of pressure on a high school football coach. In small towns where football is an economic pillar, coach is just as popular as the town preacher. While a preacher is always in the good graces of God, a coach has his good graces contingent upon good games. When winning is that important, you look for advantages to win wherever you can find it. Those teams are working out once a day, we're going to do 2 a day. You become a good player, you got to become a great player. Coaches need to come up with better and smarter plays than the other guys. They need to go to other teams' games and figure out their strategy and become better at making plays than they are. But now you also have sporting good ads in the paper telling you that their equipment can also give you an advantage. Here's an example from the book No Game for Boys to Play. Quote, in 1935, Rawlings published a football equipment advertisement entitled, quote, Banish Fear of Injuries, end quote, in the Athletic Journal, a trade journal aimed at coaches. The subsequent text emphasized that without fear of injuries, athletes could play tougher. It said, your men can smash through and play their hardest when outfitted with Rawlings equipment. They'll buck, tackle, and block with that air of confidence born only through banishment of injury fears. The Wilson Sporting Goods Company told coaches that, quote, the ability of your team to win, end quote, depended on the action, protection, and comfort afforded by their lines of football equipment, end quote. Again, that's from the book No Game for Boys to Play. And if you're a coach under pressure to win, you can see how that would be appealing to you, right? And look, this isn't pointing fingers or accusing anybody of any sort of wrongdoing. I'm not saying that coaches wanted to hurt players. They just wanted to win. And when you have game plans that rely on blocking really well, tackling guys, you want your players to stop other players in their tracks. You want your players to blow right through the line. You at least want your players to play without fear. And also, you don't want your players getting hurt. And you also, if you're a coach that's desperate to win over a rival, you worry about your rival getting their hands on this stuff that's being advertised as enabling you to play the game a little bit better. And if you're a 16, 17, 15-year-old kid under a lot of pressure to win and you get your hands on this new robust equipment, well, you can imagine how that goes. Again, not accusing anybody of anything, but we're all human. And one more side note, just quoted some of those advertisements straight out of the book No Game for Boys to Play. I do believe that the people actually making sports equipment want to make the game safer, want players to have less injuries, and want that equipment they're working on to be a good thing for the game. This whole language of smashing through opponents and tackling harder and doing that better, that was written by advertising people, not necessarily by the people that designed the helmet. So just consider that. Okay, so the game is booming. More high schools are developing programs all across the country. Players are starting to play at a younger and younger age as different, smaller leagues start to develop. And of course, the sporting good industry is keeping up with all of that, selling more than they ever have before in various sizes for all kinds of players, from age 8 all the way up to the NFL. And we've talked about the design of helmets, the people who have designed it, who have put it to good use. And while the design of a helmet can be an advantage, let's talk about aesthetics as an advantage. Yeah, looks can kill. All right, not kill, but it could help you win. By the mid-1930s, there had been various teams out there that had toyed around with the idea of painting their helmets a different color. For one reason or another, it didn't catch on. Maybe because paint doesn't stick to leather all that well, because leather flexes around, it takes an impact, and now that paint starts to chip off, and then you have to repaint them, sometimes every single game. And why go through all that effort and spend that money on paint when it doesn't really create an advantage, right? Well, there was a benefit. The mainstream just needed to find out about it. And one coach would bring that to popularity. His name was Fritz Kreisler. Now, before I start talking about Coach Kreisler, I got to go back just a second to that fiber-reinforced helmet I was talking about earlier. You had these new leather helmets that were a little bit harder because they had a fiber reinforcement that was stitched into the different parts of the leather helmet. So the whole helmet itself was not fiber reinforced, but sections of it were. One section stitched into the leather helmet that was fiber reinforced was the forehead part. That was a wing-looking section. It covered the whole forehead, wrapped around toward the temples, and tapered as it went toward the temples. So it looked like a wing on a helmet. Now, at the top of this wing shape were 3 stripes that would go over the head and down the back. Those were also fiber reinforced to protect the top of the head and to give the helmet a little bit more rigidity. In 1935, Fritz Kreisler was entering his 4th season as the coach of Princeton, an innovative coach who understands the power of being a great coach because he was a player for Amos Alonzo Stagg at the University of Chicago and then studied under him as an assistant coach for a few years as well. Some thought that Kreisler was being groomed to take over for the legendary coach Stagg, but that wouldn't be the case. He would go on to Minnesota before finding his way to Princeton. Now, his first year at Princeton wasn't that good. In 1932, his team had a 2-2-3 record. But the following year, they would go 9-0. Then the following year goes 7-1. But he needed another good season. And ahead of this one, he thought of a different way to gain an advantage than through the playbook. He had his helmets painted, 2-tone colors in the colors of the school. The leather parts of the helmet would be the colored background, while the fiber reinforced sections would have a separate color. So the wing had a color that was separate from the background, as well as the fiber reinforced strips that go over the top of the head. Did it create an advantage? Well, I don't know, because he'd already won a national championship with Princeton, went 7-1 the year before, but he did have a 9-0 record that year, outscoring their opponents by a total of 256-32. They averaged 28.4 points per game, which was the 4th best in all of college football. And of course, they were named national champions by the Dunkel system retroactively. What advantage is gained by colored helmets? A little bit of intimidation, maybe? Because, I don't know, I've been the victim of that and playing a competitive sport and seeing a team out there in very nice, much better uniforms, a little bit creative. I don't know, it seems like they've got their act together a little bit better than us. But it allows players to easily identify one another amid the chaos of the game. You can imagine how much easier it is for a quarterback to find their targets and complete a pass. And it must have been beneficial in that way because Princeton quarterback Ken Sandbach, who was the quarterback that year of 1935 and was amassing those 4th best in college football points, was also named to the All-Eastern football team by the Associated Press. If the painted helmet wasn't beneficial, it would have ended there. But when Fritz Kreisler left Princeton to become the coach of the University of Michigan in 1938, he had his new team's helmets painted to have the fiber-reinforced sections of the helmet, that front wing, and the 3 stripes going over the head, maize yellow, and the rest was Michigan blue. To this day, the Michigan winged helmet design that debuted against Michigan State on October 1st, 1938 is iconic with Wolverine sports. The football team still has that design, as do their hockey team's helmets, baseball helmets, lacrosse helmets, and more. Even their swim team, for short stints of time, have their swim caps with that winged helmet design. Now, Kreisler, being a study under the legendary Amos Alonzo Stagg, he knew the importance of great coaching and how important it was to innovate and look for an advantage in every nook and cranny. Coloring the helmet, and this winged helmet design was one of those random places that you find just a slight advantage. He changed the look of football by painting the helmets and winning with them. Other teams had tried it before, but Fritz Kreisler brought it to the mainstream. And know this, Kreisler was a very good coach. Whether he'd ended up painting helmets or not, he still would be a legendary coach because of what he was able to accomplish on the field. And this wouldn't be the last time that Kreisler, looking for an advantage, would introduce an innovation that would literally change the game of football. Less than a decade later, in 1945, he introduced two-platoon football into the game. Two-platoon football is when you have separate corps that play defense and offense. Now, in the 1930s, players had to play on both sides of the ball. You were part of the 11 that would play on offense and defense. And when a player was substituted out of the game, he couldn't return in that same half. So you leave the game in the first half, you can't return till the second. Leave in the second, your day's over. But because of the wartime effort and different rule changes, they ended up in the 1940s having unlimited substitutions. Now, Kreisler, being the guy that looks for an advantage everywhere, he saw one here. The rule didn't explicitly say, you can play two-platoon football now, and everybody do it. Kreisler just saw an opportunity with unlimited substitutions. He said, what if we had players who specialized in defense and players who specialized in offense. 2 groups for 2 sides of the game. That meant you had players who were rested, and you had players drastically reducing their exposure to injury. Now, you look for an advantage when you're playing teams that are clearly much better than you are, and so he tried out this advantage against Army in 1945 during their game at Yankee Stadium. Now, the Army Cadets were a powerhouse team at the time because it was wartime and most college-age men were in the service, so Army had the best players. Even still, this 2-platoon idea gave his team an advantage against Army. Sort of. Michigan lost that game 28-7, but that advantage is in the numbers. Army averaged 46 points per game that season, so the Wolverines held them to just about half that. And there were only 4 teams that got a touchdown on Army that year, Michigan being one of them. Now here's the real kicker. Army also had a major advantage in that game. An advantage that was a huge game changer and that no other team in football had access to at that time. What is it? Well, it's an innovation born from communication. And we talked about how important communication is in the growth of a sport. Cameras are part of communication. Now, the Eastman Company in Tennessee made chemicals for Kodak that was used in their films and developing a film, but in experimenting with their chemicals, they discovered a type of plastic called tennite. The uses were endless. Instead of companies having to make things out of metal or wood that took a long time to process and were kind of expensive, let's face it, you want to shape something out of wood, you got to order the lumber, shape the lumber, carve it, sand it, glue it together, finish it. It's an expensive and long process, and that wood will wear down over time. It breaks easier, and it needs to be refinished after a few years. Tennite plastic doesn't need to do that. You pour it into a mold, it's done. Now, initially, they thought we could use this to replace our metal film reels, but then the auto industry got in on this, used it to make dashboards and steering wheels. Other companies used it to make appliances, phones, whatever you could think of. But a former high school football coach in Evanston, Illinois, who had made a small fortune inventing a type of cleat that could screw and unscrew off the bottom of the foot, he saw potential in this new material called tennite. And his realization would lead to one of the biggest pivotal moments in football equipment evolution: the plastic helmet. A helmet that would be lighter, stronger, and more powerful than anything before it. This helmet would change the way players play, the way coaches coach. It literally changed the rules. It'll do everything from winning a world war to draping up a steel curtain. But all of that's going to have to wait until the next episode of How Gear Changed the Game. Thanks to our guests for coming on the show today. Ken Crippen of the Football Learning Academy. You can find out more at football-learning-academy.com. And thanks to Matt Cheney of Four Walls Publishing for coming on and sharing his knowledge and years of research with us. You can find out more at his website, which is fourwallspublishing.com. We'll be hearing from both of them in future episodes of How Gear Changed the Game as we talk about the plastic helmet, the origins of pro football, and so much more interesting stuff. These are interesting folks with a wealth of knowledge, and it was really nice of them to come on the show, make some time, and share that knowledge with us. I've been your host, Alex Kindig Sherman. I like researching sports history, and I've always had an interest in the gear used to play the game. So this project is something I bring to you out of fascination and interest. If I may borrow a quote from Vince Lombardi that he once said during a speech about what it takes to become a winner, quote, "I am not an expert. I'm simply a conduit for this information. The only thing different between you and I is that I've thought about these things a little bit more than you have," end quote. The goal has been to simply share some interesting facts about the evolution of the gear and the game. That is the goal moving forward as we explore more about not just the football helmet, but other gear and other sports. To be notified when our next episode comes out, as well as other episodes about other sports and other pieces of gear and how they change the game, please subscribe to the podcast. That way you don't have to make an effort to remember to check for new episodes. And also, subscribing is a huge help to the podcast. So again, please, if you have a second, go ahead and take out your phone, hit subscribe. Thanks in advance. And thanks for listening. Here's the episode epilogue, as well as some disclaimers. Look, I understand that the game of football, when it comes to helmets, hard hits, violence, and concussions, is a little bit of a minefield right now. It's kind of politically charged. I, at no point, am trying to push any kind of agenda or be political in any way. I am simply trying to truthfully tell the story of football evolution and the role that the helmet played in it. And it's not to push an agenda, it's merely out of fascination and interest. And I've tried to be impartial, fair, non-political, whatever you want to call it, all the way through. When injuries and concussions come up in the show, it's simply because that's part of the story. Injuries and concussions, it's part of playing the game. If those didn't exist, the helmet wouldn't exist. And in exploring evolution, we have to explore things like the human condition, the way people think, the context of everything. So I hope you realize that I've been trying to tell a story genuinely and truthfully, and do it from a position of fairness and neutrality. Another thing to note is, even though it pained me to do so, in some sections I did have to oversimplify some things or simply gloss over certain points in history when I could have gone into more detail. That was for the sake of time. Here we are, over 90 minutes into this episode 1 of what's a 3-parter. We would be only an eighth of the way through this first episode if I didn't edit things down just a little bit. Another great resource that I must call out here in our credits is AntiqueFootball.com. They were a great resource in researching the early years of the football helmet. They have all kinds of information on their website, AntiqueFootball.com. Everything from articles to actual helmets that are on display. So check that out. Again, it's AntiqueFootball.com. I put a lot of time into researching, and I put a lot of effort into jam-packing every moment that I can in this show with interesting information that I feel would be worth your while. I understand that your time is valuable, and I don't want to waste a second of it. So I hope that you found something interesting and that you enjoyed this, and maybe even enjoyed it enough to join us for future episodes. If you have any suggestions, kind comments, polite responses to the show, you can reach us at howgearchangethegame@gmail.com.